Hello. If you were looking for a scare tonight, you've come to the right place. I'll be narrating an hour's worth of creepy horror stories that I found off of Reddit. So without further ado,
These are their stories.
I was 17 years old at the time this happened. I went to this youth church event and it was supposed to be like prom, since the country I live in don't have events like that. Some people showed up with dates, but my girls and I decided to show up together. There were a lot of people in the event, some I didn't even recognize. Later into the night, a man asked me to slow dance. I didn't know him, but I knew he was new at our church, so as to be polite I said yes. As he ushered me into the dance floor, he introduced himself. Let's call him Caleb for this story. I noticed he had an accent, and I brought it up in conversation, and he said that he grew up in the UK. Throughout the dance we talked and got to know each other a bit. I remember thinking that he was a pretty sweet guy. He told me that he was invited to the event and didn't really know anyone, and that he just moved for work and was in his 20s. I forgot his actual age. Immediately I was kind of weirded out by the age gap, but decided not to think too much about it. This was all just a friendly interaction. After the song finished, he asked if we could dance again. I made an excuse that I needed to grab a drink and freshen up. He said that he was willing to grab me a drink while I went to the washroom. I hesitantly agreed and made my way to the washroom. I stayed in the washroom for one song, hoping that he would get tired of waiting for me, but when I got back to the event, he was sitting at my table. I could tell he was looking for me in the crowd, and when his eyes landed on me, he smiled and beckoned me over. In that moment, I remember thinking to myself that maybe he needed company since he didn't know anyone at the event. I sat beside him and he gave me the drink he got for me. I did not drink it. He asked again if I wanted to dance, but this time I said no and said that I was tired. He didn't leave the table though, but stayed to talk with me. At this point, I just wanted to get out of the conversation, be away from him. I told him that I was going to go talk to my friend in the other table. I told my friend what was going on and I stayed at her table until the guy left. For the rest of the night, I didn't see him and thought that was the end of that. I worked at a women's clothing store in a mall. After school, I usually would have a closing shift, 3 shifts a week. I went to clock in and a coworker of mine told me that a man was looking for me and that I just missed him. I thought nothing of it and thought maybe it was just a friend of mine or a family member. Next shift it happened again, and I asked my coworker what he looked like and they described Caleb to me. How did he know I worked there? I was shocked, and it became even creepier when it happened again on my next shift. It had been almost a week and I was just glad we kept missing each other, but I figured my luck ran out when I saw him waiting by the door to the store as I was coming in for my shift. He greeted me and told me that he had been wanting to talk to me. I asked him why and he said he wanted to take me out on a date. I have never been on a date before and I honestly didn't want my first one to be with him, so I said no. He then asked if he could just buy me food at the food court for my break. At this point, I was getting the feeling that he didn't want to take no for an answer. I figured that it was a public place and that he wouldn't try anything, so I foolishly agreed. He went in the store with me and walked me to the back room as he talked about how he was glad to see me and that there was more he wanted to know about me. As my shift started, I noticed he was still in the store, looking around. He stayed for about an hour and often I would catch him looking at me. Where I was, he was also nearby. This went on for about an hour and I was very creeped out. I let one of my coworkers know what was going on and told her that if I wasn't back after my break, that she should let the security or someone know. I only had 30 minutes for my break, so I was hoping for the time to go fast. I made my way out of the back room, and as I pushed open the door, he was already there waiting for me. We walked to the food court, and on the way there we had some small talk. But what creeped me out is when he asked if he could have my number. I lied and told him I didn't have a phone yet. He bought me food, but he didn't buy anything for himself. So there we were, sat at one of the tables as he watched me eat. The conversation was dry and I was quick and short in my responses. I just wanted it to end already. He kept asking about my life, what I like to do for fun, and so on. He then asked if I have a boyfriend. I said no and that I didn't want to be in a relationship. I quickly finished my food and told him that we should head back. He insisted on staying as there was 10 minutes left of my break. I lied and said I needed that extra time to finish one of my tasks. The walk back to the store was quiet. I found it weird because he was so talkative before and now he was just dead silent. Once we were at the front of the store, I said my goodbye and turned to leave, but he caught my arm and pulled me close to him. He said that he liked me ever since he saw me at the event and that he wanted to get to know me more and was interested in me. Mind you, I'm 17 and this guy's in his 20s. It all felt wrong and I backed away from him. I was as frank as I could be and told him that I'm not interested in him or being in a relationship. He asked if we could at least keep in touch through my socials and I told him I wasn't comfortable giving him that information. He then had the audacity to ask if he could just hug me, and I wasn't sure what to say, and before I could say anything, he pulled me in for a hug. It was a tight hug and I pulled away quickly. He said he was sorry for surprising, said goodbye and walked off. After that incident, I didn't see him at the store. I did see him a couple of times at church and he would smile at me and try to talk to me, but I would always try to avoid him. He then stopped coming to church and I never saw him again. So to the creepy guy who liked me, let's not meet ever again. My family and I have been going through a very strange experience over the last couple of months. It's hard to even put into words or explain what is going on. I guess I can just start off from where it all started to feel off. A few months back, my family had a big get-together. My parents both have 2 siblings. They all got married and had some kids. Well, all of them except Uncle Matt. He never got married or had kids. That means I have 10 cousins. My aunts and uncles all live within 2 hours of us, so we've all grown up together. That being said, we don't normally have all my aunts and uncles in a house at once. This was a rare occasion to have a family meal when they were all free. I will not be naming every single family member in this post, because that seems like a lot of information, and honestly, you've already gotten more information about my family than you ever wanted, but I promise this context is important. Okay, enough with my babbling. Let's talk about what happened that weird night. My parents and I went over to my Aunt Margot and Uncle Ken's house for a BBQ in the backyard. The backyard felt loud and chaotic. I tried to stay out of the way and get the night over with. I was honestly just there for the free food. We were all sitting down at a big table outside. I was so focused on making sure none of the napkins went flying in the wind, I wasn't listening to the conversation. My Aunt Margot came over to the table with a plate of really burnt hot dogs. My mom immediately started to laugh at the sight of them. Is burning food genetic or something? How on earth do you guys always do that to food? The Jensens need to leave the cooking to the Millers. My mom said with a sarcastic giggle. Uncle Ken looked at her confused. What are you on about, Liz? Uncle Ken snapped back. I mean, Margot burnt the hot dogs, and Matt always burns food when he cooks. Remember, we had to ban him for months from cooking because we had to order takeout like 3 times in a row. Everyone at the table laughed, recalling their memories. Sighs of recollection bounced back and forth from person to person when my dad spoke up in Aunt Margot's defense. Honey, what are you talking about? Matt is your brother. I really shouldn't have to remind you of that. My mom rolled her eyes in response to my dad. I spoke up because I was suddenly confused about which side of the family Uncle Matt was actually on. You would think I would naturally just know that, but all my aunts and uncles act like siblings and call each other their siblings. My grandparents often refer to their son, daughter-in-laws as just their kids, so it isn't something I always think about. Wait, I'm confused. Whose side is Uncle Matt on? What is the joke? I don't get it, I asked, but was only met with a laugh from all the parents at the table. I finally got an answer from my mom following the silence of the joke that somehow went over my head. Don't be silly, baby. Matt is your dad's brother. As the words left her mouth, half the table looked confused. Liz, what are you talking about? He is on your side. He is a Miller, my Aunt Margot said as she scraped off the burnt edges of her hot dog. Okay, now I'm with Amanda. I don't get the joke, my mom said while looking at me with narrow, inquisitive eyes and then at the rest of the group. Wait, everyone slow down, Aunt June said, speaking up for probably the first time in the night. This is dumb. Matt is not Liz and I's brother. He has to be on the Jensen side of the family. I sat at the table watching my family in silence. Their eyes darted back and forth. They stopped laughing and were all just scratching their heads. After a few minutes, my mom got out her phone. She found an old family photo from when she was a kid. In the photo were her, my grandparents, my Uncle Paul, and my Aunt June. Nothing out of the ordinary. After looking at the picture, Aunt Margot got out her phone and looked for an old childhood photo. Aha, found one, she stated as she showed off the photo on her phone. Yet again, the photo was normal. It had my grandparents, my dad, Aunt Margot, and Aunt Susan. The next hour consisted of both sides of the family going back and forth showing photos, none of them with Uncle Matt in them. I had a few of my cousins there, but they all lost interest once they ate. I, on the other hand, couldn't be pulled away. I was engrossed in learning where the heck Uncle Matt came from. They kept talking back and forth. They figured maybe he wasn't anyone's sibling. Maybe he was related by marriage or a second cousin twice removed that I just called Uncle Matt because that was the easiest thing to call him. We all have a relative like that, right? I know an easy solution you might be thinking of is to just call him up. That's also what I said, but he was working and they didn't want to interrupt him, but guess what? I needed answers, so I decided to call him. However, when I looked at my phone, I couldn't find him in my contacts. I looked through it multiple times. I remember texting him about something a few days back, so he should have been in my text history. Still nothing. After being weirded out by his contact being gone, I mentioned out loud that someone should call him, regardless of him being at work. No one agreed with me, but once I told them his contact was missing from my phone, they all got curious and looked to see if he was missing for them too. We were all in shock to find him missing from all our phones. The family started to dig through their camera rolls and any digital libraries they had to try and find any photo of him. Uncle Andrew thought he had a photo of the back of him, but we soon found that we all remembered him looking differently. Uncle Andrew showed a picture of the back of a bald man who looked pretty tall. Aunt June called him crazy and recalled him having long curly red hair. It wasn't like we hadn't seen him in a year or that he was some kind of distant memory. I saw the guy last week. He came over to my house to help me with some homework, and I can tell you he didn't have red hair or no hair at all. He was, well, shoot, I can't remember what he looked like now that I think about it. It was safe to say we were all creeped out. As the sun went down and it got chilly out, the group moved inside. Normally, this is when everyone would go home, but I saw Aunt Margot start a pot of coffee. It was going to be a long night. The air was tense and full of unease. None of the adults wanted to go home until they had answers. I could tell the adults wanted to talk more but didn't want to worry the younger cousins. My older cousin Maddie clearly didn't care about anything that was going on. She just wanted to sleep. We convinced her to take my 3 young cousins into the basement so they could all get some sleep, but not me. I was invested. Uncle Matt and I are close. We see each other all the time. How could I not have a shred of evidence that he even existed? As my cousins shuffled downstairs, all the adults huddled around a big whiteboard Aunt Margot slapped on the kitchen island. They started to write down everything they could remember. What he looked like, the last time they saw him, memories of him. None of it was coherent. It seemed he was a completely different person in all our memories, even if it was a memory where multiple people were around. One of the only things that we could all agree on was that the Jensens always thought he was on the Millers side of the family and the Millers always thought he was on the Jensen side. My mom recalled a story of Matt and my dad going to a lake to fish, but the hook got stuck on Matt's hat and went flying. My dad told us he remembered my mom telling him the same exact story many times. Everyone had memories of stories where he was on the other side of the family. Soon everyone was on the phone with a new family member trying to tell them the situation and asking what they thought about everything. My aunts and uncles were talking to realities on the phone I didn't know I had. Relatives that probably only met Matt a couple times at best. All I heard was one dead end at a time. No one knew where he came from or where he went. So the big question was, who is Matt? Was he just some random guy who weaseled his way into the family, telling one side of the family one thing and the other side another, or was it something so much worse? As the sun came up that Saturday morning, we were all still scratching our heads. The deeper we got into who Matt was, the more freaked out everyone got. I was honestly surprised they let me stay with him all night long. The more digging everyone did, the farther away we felt. The more rabbit holes we went down, the less real he seemed. We couldn't find any evidence that he ever existed. Some of us searched all over the internet for Matt Jensen or Matt Miller, and a few of us searched for other last names in the family. Of course, it was kind of hard to know who we were looking for given we didn't know what he really looked like. After hours of discussion, we compiled a list of attributes that never wavered about Uncle Matt. He was a man, he never had a mustache, he was tall, he was bad at math, and he loved Jim Carrey movies. That might seem like a random grouping of facts, but that's because it was. We couldn't even remember where his house was. Some of us completely forgot and others remembered different houses. It didn't matter. We weren't going to start knocking on doors to find a man we were concerned never existed. We started to believe that as soon as we began to question who he was, he just simply started to fade away into nothingness, like it was some kind of self-destructive on his own consciousness. It was around 9 in the morning when people started to fall asleep on couches. The night before started with everyone being determined and saying the night wouldn't end until we found Uncle Matt, but here we all were, exhausted and with little to no answers. It felt like accepting defeat by napping on the couch, but we couldn't do much else. At 11 in the morning, we all woke up to the sound of my cousins playing in the next room over. We all sat up and rubbed our eyes. You could practically see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they woke up from their stupors. I could tell when they realized their memories actually happened and it wasn't just a weird fever dream. My Aunt Margot stumbled to the kitchen while yawning and started to dig in the pantry for something substantial the kids could all eat. It was clear they had already raided the cookie stash. As the adults had a quiet conversation, we heard something come from my cousin Cass that made us freeze. Yeah, remember last night when Uncle Matt gave us all those cookies? It was so much fun, my small cousin said with a hop and a skip. Wait, Cass, get over here and say that again. My Uncle Andrew yelled in an attempt to sound intimidating, but came out with a voice crack. Cass walked over to us looking like a confused puppy who just got yelled at. What did I do wrong, Uncle Andrew? I thought if Uncle Matt offered us cookies, I could have them. Cass, you are not in trouble. This is very important. Are you telling me Uncle Matt was with you guys last night? Uncle Andrew tried to say in a gentle tone to not scare Cass. I mean, not the whole night, but he brought us all cookies and put a movie on for us. Then he said he wanted to go hang out with you guys upstairs. Cass told us with a quiet voice. Everyone started to frantically look around the room, looking for any evidence of him being there last night. We quickly asked the rest of the cousins if they saw Matt, and some kids did and some didn't. I noticed something when I started to count the objects in the room. There were 10 adults and me upstairs last night, so there should have been 11 people in total, but I saw 12 plates out with the leftover crumbs from our late night pizza, 12 spots laid out for sleeping in the living room, and 12 mugs or cups of coffee. He was here last night. As I mentioned what I found, my dad said he remembered seeing him last night. He said Matt brought him some water. Uncle Paul said he saw him go to the bathroom but couldn't remember him coming out. They mentioned how it felt like it never actually happened, but he managed to place the memory in them after the fact. How else would they see Uncle Matt right in front of them and not realize what was happening? I had a strange feeling that started to bubble up. I felt uneasy and restless. Wait, something is off here, I said loudly to the room. Everyone line up on the wall, I want to try something. For a second they all looked at me confused. They normally wouldn't let me boss them around like that, but they were desperate and tired. All the adults lined up against the wall. As I walked by then, I counted out loud. Something strange happened. I counted 12 people, including me. None of the kids were lined up. I wasn't counting myself twice. There was an extra person. Uncle Matt wasn't just here last night. He was with us in the room at that moment. Other members of the family even tried to count. We did it over and over again, even adding one of the kids to the mix, but every single time there was one extra person, but we still couldn't see him. How was he hiding in plain sight? Everyone ended up leaving my Aunt Margot's house that afternoon. We were all still extremely creeped out about the whole thing, but what could we do about it? Not much. It's not like Uncle Matt ever did anything violent. Mostly normal behavior, except for a few memories of him that were kinda weird. One of us remembered seeing him in the kitchen, stacking and unstacking bowls for hours. Another person remembered him once packing for a vacation, but his suitcase only had trash bags in it. And I have a memory of us sitting in front of a fireplace with him reading the instruction manual to a blender for a bedtime story. At least those were the kind of memories we had in the beginning. As the weeks went on, we started to remember things that got more and more concerning. He showed up in our houses in the middle of the night, or buying us all hammers for Christmas. He once bought hundreds of dollars worth of knives and put them in my dad's car. Once we developed disturbing memories of him, we tried to tell the police. Of course, they couldn't find any evidence of his existence, so they couldn't help us. It didn't help our case that we couldn't even give them a last name. How on earth are they supposed to find a guy based on his name being Matt and no physical features? So who is Uncle Matt? I can say with 100% certainty I have no clue. Is he a man? Is he an entity? Is he a figment of our imaginations? Or is he nothing at all? I don't know, and that's the worst part of all. He seems to always be around at family dinners. Most of the time I count the number of people, I end up with an extra person. He feels like a virus, always implanting a memory of himself being around, but in the moment I never see him. It seems to be a family joke at this point, always leaving out an extra plate for him or something. In my opinion, no one is taking the situation seriously. I know he hasn't hurt anyone, but why should we wait for something to happen? I swear I can feel it when he shows up. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My family has given up on trying to figure out who or what Uncle Uncle Matt is, but I haven't. It feels like they have all just forgotten the disturbing memories of him. I swear the deeper I dig to find him, the worse the memories get. Like he is rotting and festering in my memories, right before my eyes. I'm starting to think it's his attempt to stop me from looking for him. The fact that he is punishing me for looking for him makes my concern grow more and more. Why is he suddenly running now that I am on to him? Why is he so afraid of me finding him? And what will happen once I do find him? I will find you, Uncle Matt. I will find out what you are. I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for the walk signal. I have my location shared with my sister and mom. I keep my wits about me when I'm out in public, and I try not to dawdle after getting into my car. If I had only been more diligent about that last rule, I might not be in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside of my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from picking up a friend's evening shift, and so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store is in an isolated part of town, but I had never felt unsafe in the area. Then again, I'd never been so late at night. The second I exited the store with my purchase, the old cashier closed up shop for the night and turned off all the lights in the building. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to linger in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often has to run errands after dark. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that, due to a recent breakup, my house hasn't felt all that welcoming in the past few weeks. In any case, I was in no rush to return home. I pulled up an episode of The Terror on my phone and settled in to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of blissful peace and quiet before a shout pierced through the night. I looked up from my phone and was surprised to find a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms at me. My car was parked right in front of the store, facing towards the building, and there was only a thin sidewalk separating my vehicle from the store's exterior. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was like she had emerged from the brick wall before me. She rounded my car, coming to a stop beside the driver's side window. She then started pointing at the ground, the universal signal for roll your window down. Fat chance, I thought. Though she looked sane and kempt, I had no clue what her intentions were. In fact, I felt pretty vindicated in always locking my car doors immediately after entering. The woman, perhaps seeing I was making no move to exit my vehicle, then told me something no one wants to hear. "Hey," she shouted, "there's someone in your back seat." My mouth went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes raced through my head. I could almost feel the piano wire digging into my neck, the barrel pressing into my temple. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to launch myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew I was aware of their presence, would I even have enough time to run? With one hand on the door handle, I stole a glance into the rearview mirror and saw no one. My car is a compact hatchback, meaning there is very little room for a person to hide in my cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone upon looking into the mirror. My terror fading to confusion, I turned around in my seat, surveying the cabin with my own eyes, and confirmed that there was no one in my back seat. Click. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was barely a foot from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. There were a few more deep clicks as she tried unsuccessfully to open the locked door. I raised my gaze, and she gave me an odd smile, as though she and I were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at the woman's face. Her skin was stretched tightly across her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they'd been cut onto her. Her eyes were deep set and ovate, and her teeth seemed both too small and too numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment to gawk at the face before me, and then I threw my car into reverse and hightailed it out of the lot. For a few disheartening seconds, the woman held onto the door, keeping in step with my vehicle as I backed up. Luckily, she soon let go and I drove away, my mind racing with the realization that the woman was trying to bait me out of my car. Even more disturbing was the fact that it had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I simply hadn't seen, and what she had wanted from me. I hoped I had narrowly escaped a robbery as opposed to something much more sinister. I got back to my house 20 minutes later. Still shaken from my encounter, I rushed inside the house and made sure that all of my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little candle to soothe my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring up flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. Once I finally fell asleep, my fears followed me from the waking world. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that when I jolted awake some hours later, it was to the sound of a frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming or not. My alarm clock read 4:17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the forcefulness of the knocks, there may have been. Slowly, I rose from my bed and inched towards the entryway. I had never before been in such a situation and was at somewhat of a loss as to how to react. I didn't smell a fire, thankfully, but that didn't mean all was well. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling out my name in a questioning tone. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who is it?" I called back. "Brian," answered the disembodied voice, and relief washed over me. My neighbor Brian lived in the house across the street. We weren't close exactly, but I often saw him walking down the block with his dog Bailey. I turned on the entryway light, but as I was still in my sleepwear, I didn't want to open the door unless I had to. Instead, I called back to him. "What's the matter?" "Well," he began. I heard his voice crack and he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "No, I don't. Why do you ask?" "Well, the dog had to go out, and while I was in the yard with him, I thought I saw someone in your front window. Someone who didn't look quite right." I stilled, feeling as though I were in some terrible dream. Turning around and glancing down the dark hallway, I wished I had turned on more lights on my way to answer the door. "She followed you home," I thought. "She's in your house with you right now." I was ready to bolt out the door into the cold, but by some miracle, I had just enough presence of mind left to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something was wrong. I stepped away from the door. "Are you alright, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he next spoke, his voice sounded slightly different from before, as though he were testing out a new timbre. "Of course, I just got a bit of a cold here, but I still wanted to check in on you." My voice wavered as I voiced a question to my neighbor. "But your dog, isn't it a girl?" Brian didn't respond. My mind reeled in the torturous silence, trying to discern whether the threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of complete stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It rotated downwards as far as it could before the lock stopped it, then shook as the person on the other side of my door pulled on the handle. This happened several more times as the person tested my lock, and then there was a powerful bang, as though someone had rammed into my door with all their might. After that, there was silence again. I stood frozen in place for another minute. I had no peephole, but I worked up the nerve to walk into the living room and peer through the blinds into my front yard. In the distance, walking down the street away from my house, was a figure. Although I couldn't see the face, something deep within me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched her walk away into the quiet night until she disappeared from my view. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I split my time between roaming the perimeter of my house, looking for anything suspicious, and sitting in my kitchen running the events of the night over in my mind. The most likely explanation was that I'd been dreaming. After all, I'd nearly been baited into opening my door to a potential criminal just hours before, so it made sense that I'd have a nightmare about a similar situation. Then again, I had never in my entire life had a dream so vivid. Maybe somehow the woman really did follow me home. She easily could have stuck a tracker on my car, but how in the world did she know Brian's name, and how had she impersonated him so well? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day. I've been too haunted by the idea of someone, or multiple someones, trying to draw me out into the open. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel as though I catch glimpses of the woman in my periphery, of her beady eyes and uncanny smile. So to set the scene, I'm a female. I'm 22 and literally weeks from graduating from college and getting my bachelor's in theater arts. I only have a quarter credit left to get, so I'm doing work in the theater department's costume shop to get that credit. It's not anything too hard. I know how to both hand sew and use a sewing machine, so I've spent time doing both things and mending and adjusting garments for actors. The show is a musical and there are some pretty intricate costumes, so I was excited to help out to get that final bit of credit and graduate graduate. The costume shop opened for weekend hours at around noon, but I stayed up late on Friday night, so I woke up around 1. I got dressed and went to the costume shop as quick as I could since I wanted to get all the hours possible. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but as I was approaching the theater building, something caught my eye. There was this guy standing off to the side of the front entrance. The front entrance is pretty open. It's this set of pillars and then 3 sets of glass doors that are led up to by a set of steps. The building is an old one with an addition attached, that one containing the actual theater, while the older building contains mainly classrooms. But this entrance is closest to the way I usually use to get backstage and into the costume shop. Anyway, the guy was kind of leaning against the stone side of the staircase. What caught my attention is that I go to school on a very small campus, so usually when I see someone, I recognize their face, even if I don't know their name. I didn't recognize this guy at all. Physically, he wasn't overly weird looking, maybe a little disheveled. His hair was kinda greasy, and he had on a t-shirt and some tattered jeans. He looked college-aged, same as me. But what was even weirder was that he was wearing this heavy winter parka, even though it was nearing 65 degrees, as well as snow boots. We made eye contact, and nothing immediately skeeved me out. I'm an awkward person, so I just kind of gave a polite nod and a smile. I think that was my first mistake. He didn't smile back. In fact, his eyes followed me as I walked up the stairs and into the building. Super weird, but okay. My campus has some weirdos on it. I've found that my school in particular seems to attract them, but I'm a senior, and I was pretty sure I had all of the weirdos pretty much cataloged. Parka guy was not among my mental catalog of campus oddities. I got down to the costume shop, and I must have looked troubled because the person who was already down there, someone I know on a somewhat personal level, greeted me, then asked if something was wrong. I told them about the guy, which somewhat amused them, and we speculated on who he could be for a while before they went up to check. Apparently though, he was gone, as I was told when they got back. I worked on sewing literal halved beach balls onto bikini tops. The show is a funky one, and listened to a podcast. I got there at 1 and it was around 4:30 that the person there with me left, leaving me alone. By this point, I'd moved on from the tops and was sewing some snaps onto the back of a blouse to make it fasten better. I took a break to work on a project due Monday, then got back to sewing. My headphones off this time as it was just me down in the shop. For this next part, I'm going to have to give you a bit of an idea of the layout of the shop. It's in the basement of the building and is a bit hard to get to if you don't know your way around. The room is relatively large. It's sort of shaped like an irregular rectangle, but is separated by the tables set up in the middle of the room with the sewing machines on them. One side is the way in from backstage behind the building's black box theater, as well as the dressing rooms, and then the other side leads out into the sort of hallway that has doors leading into the auditorium, as well as an exit out of the building. If that made any sense at all, I'm glad. That direction also leads to the main costume storage room. But anyway, near where the sewing machine tables is this door that leads outside and into what the costume director refers to as the weird little courtyard. When I was a freshman, I took a class with her, and she warned us not to go out there since the door's locked from the outside. And if we go out there, we won't be able to get back into the building. The courtyard is less of a courtyard and more of some kind of area where a bunch of the building's machinery for like heating and cooling, as well as electrical stuff, is located. It's all fenced in with a chain link fence about 15 feet high, but the door leading out there is one of those doors with a window. In this situation, I was sitting in a chair directly opposite this door, close to the wall across from it, so there was about maybe 20 odd feet of space between me and this door. It was nearing 6, but since the show's dress rehearsal started that Monday, I wanted to get as much done as I could before I finished up and went for dinner. I was working on sewing the snaps onto the shirt when I heard a noise. It startled me, since I'd settled onto the rhythm of my task and listening to what my podcast was talking about, and annoyingly, I dropped my needle. It was still connected to the thread, so it wasn't lost, and I bent to pick it up from where it had fallen to the floor near my feet. It was when I lifted my head from that bent position when I saw the source of the noise. My vision was a little obscured because the space between me and the door was cluttered with a bunch of dress form mannequins that me and the other members of the crew have been using to put costume pieces on, so it was was more that I saw the door's window wasn't empty anymore. I shifted to the side a little to get a better look, and there, at the door leading out into the maintenance courtyard, was Parka Guy. The noise I heard had been him trying to open the door. I have no idea how he got in there. That door's the only way into that courtyard, so I can only assume he somehow scaled a 15-foot fence. I froze like a deer in the headlights, and for a moment it was just still as he stared at me and I stared at him. His face was expressionless, and it was as he continued to stare at me that I began to realize that this entire situation was wrong. I sort of settled back into my chair, not sure what to do, and it was in this handful of seconds that Parka Guy started trying the door again. It was, as I said before, locked, so he wasn't able to open it, thank God. It's puzzling to me now that he didn't just come in through the main entrance, as none of the doors leading down to the costume studio were locked, but maybe he tried that because, like I said, the studio's a little tricky to locate if you don't know your way around the building. The only conclusion I could come to is that he tried what I mentioned above, couldn't find me, and then while wandering around the building saw me through that door through the chain link fence and proceeded to scale it. It was at that point that I began to get scared. The door leading into the studio was to my left, and on instinct I got up to close it since it locks from the inside and you need a key to reopen it. It was as I was moving to close that door that the guy began to pound on the courtyard door. I don't know why my first instinct was to hide instead of opening the door I just closed and booking it, but I went into the small fabric storage room directly behind me, shut the door, and called campus safety. I'm not really sure why I called them and not the police, but that's what I did. I don't know, people make decisions like that when they're scared. By the time campus safety came to investigate, which was pretty fast since I was clearly terrified on the phone, the guy was gone. I don't know how he scaled the fence again in the time it took them to arrive, but he was gone. Campus safety escorted me back to my dorm and even went over to the dining hall to pick me up some dinner since I was very shaken, which I appreciated a lot. A while later, an officer came to take my statement since Campo called them, but as you can imagine, there wasn't much they could do apart from keep an eye out for this guy. I still have no idea who he was or why he was on campus, but it couldn't have been for a good reason. So Parka Guy who tried to break into the costume shop to do God knows what to me, let's not ever meet again. Back in 1998, I was a pretty broke 19-year-old guy and living with a roommate named Steve. Steve was about my age, maybe a year older. His dad had died a few years prior and had left Steve a trust fund which covered all his bills and gave him a weekly allowance on top of it until he reached a certain age, at which time he'd receive his full inheritance. Steve and I got along pretty well, but he was the kind of guy who liked to remind you if he had some degree of power over you. That aspect of his personality butted up against my own stubborn, prove the world wrong attitude on a particular night leading to the events I'm about to describe. Steve and I went over to my friend Trevor's house on Siesta Key one night. Steve drove as I didn't have a car. I don't remember why we went over there, and I don't even know that I really remember any other instance of the three of us hanging out. I just know that we went there later in the evening, maybe 9 o'clock or so. At some point, Steve and I got in a disagreement over something. I have no memory of what it was about, except that I seem to recall that it wasn't anything important that actually impacted our lives in any way. Something akin to disagreeing over a bit of movie trivia or something as inconsequential as that. Steve must have felt that he was losing the debate because he took the opportunity to remind me that he had the car and I could always walk home. Now, there are a few things to note here. First, home would be a 13-mile walk. I could not have told you that at the time, but I just looked it up for this telling. Second, we were at my best friend's house. I had stayed over there countless times and absolutely could have that night. Third, my best friend also had a car and would likely have given me a ride. So Steve's threat was completely empty, whether he realized it or not. But what was important to me at that moment was that Steve, the trust fund brat, wanted to exert control over me because his ego was bruised, and I was a stubborn hothead who would absolutely not stand for that stuff. So I silently decided that I would walk home just to spite him and show him that I wouldn't be intimidated. So a bit later, under the pretense of going to use the restroom, I left the room and quietly left the house and started the 13-mile walk home. I should note that, while I knew this was a long walk, I didn't quite understand how long it was. But it didn't matter. I needed to prove my independence. It was probably 11 p.m. or so when I left the house. I anticipated that they'd come looking for me when they discovered that I had left, so I tried to stay off the main path as best I could, determined to make the whole walk in order to make my point. This may be a good place to remind you that this is 1998 and a good 2 or 3 years before I got my first cell phone. The first hour and a half went by without incident. I made my way all the way to downtown Sarasota. The more direct route would have been to follow the main road along the waterfront, but I cut through downtown still looking to avoid Steve spotting me on his way back home. This is an area I was super comfortable with. I'd spent most of my childhood in the area and, especially in my teen years, had explored every nook and cranny of the downtown area. It was also a pretty affluent area, full of high-rise condos that look out over the Gulf of Mexico and known for theater, opera, and art galleries. As such, even past midnight, it didn't feel menacing at all, just quiet and empty. The path I'd chosen through downtown went along Pineapple Avenue, which was mostly art galleries and upscale shops. As I walked along, I saw a red hatchback sitting in the middle of the road, just a little way past an intersection up ahead of me. I noticed it had no license plate, but didn't think too much of it. I figured it was a tag applied for kind of situation. As I got nearer, the car remained stopped. The interior light was on, and I could see there were 3 or 4 guys in there. The interior light being on made me assume they were looking at a map or something, though I couldn't make out the inside of the car well enough to see anything more than the general shapes of the people. As I crossed the small intersection maybe 30 or 40 feet away from the car now, I suddenly got a really uneasy feeling. I don't know if the car was still for just too long or the figures inside too still or what. I just suddenly got to feeling very ill at ease. So instead of continuing on, I casually turned down the left side street, and as soon as the corner of the building blocked me from their view, I bolted. This was a spot where a small access road ran behind these buildings and then connected to an alley, and then another very thin alley that ran alongside a church and ended back on Pineapple Avenue, right where the red car was. I ran this sequence of alleys and popped out just in time to see the rear end of the car vanish down the side street I had run down. At this point, I wasn't scared at all. I had the idea that the guys in that car had something unpleasant in mind for me, but I knew well that I had given them the shake. There's no way in hell that they'd expect me to be back where they started. If they were looking for me, it was going to be elsewhere. So I continued along, feeling smug. After 10 or 15 minutes, I pretty much had to get out on the main road, because the alternative was walking through a seedy neighborhood that I wasn't nearly as confident about as I was downtown. As I approached the first big intersection along that main road, I saw the red car again up ahead, noticeable by the lack of license plate. I kinda grinned to myself about having foiled them. On this big road, there were some other cars here and there even at this late hour, so I felt less isolated and more at ease, until I saw the car slow to a crawl despite not being anywhere near the light yet. Suddenly, I found myself wondering if they might have spotted me again, so I decided to just cross to the other side of the street. It's a US highway, so it's several lanes wide, with a median down the center. Being on the other side would put me a fair distance from them, but when I got to the other side, that's when I realized I was in actual danger. This red hatchback suddenly sped up, racing to the intersection ahead and zipped over into the left lane, where it banked a tire-screeching U-turn to head back in my direction. Where I had crossed was a nice green space between the History Center and the Garden Club, where a gigantic tree stood. I think it was a banyan, but I could be mistaken. On the other side of that green space was a parking lot, some buildings in the bay. I wasn't familiar enough with what was back there to be able to pull a trick like I had before, so I climbed. I got as high into that tree as I could, as fast as I could. I always dressed in all black back then, so I was pretty confident I'd be nearly impossible to spot, as long as they didn't actually climb up after me. So I got up and nestled into the most hidden spot I could and tried not to make any noise at all. Hiding up in the tree, I was so surrounded by foliage that I couldn't see what was going on. On the plus side, that meant that they were really unlikely to see me. On the other hand, I didn't know what to prepare myself for, so I sat up there, running through scenarios in my head, trying to plan my next move. Even if I hadn't been outnumbered, flight was really my only option. As speedy and scrappy as I was, at 5 feet 3 inches, no fight I put up was likely to do much good. As I sat on that branch trying to plan my next move, my blood ran cold. Any remaining doubt about what was happening, any fleeting hope that I was just being paranoid, flew out the window as I heard car doors open and close, heard footsteps in the grass, and eventually an angry male voice say, "Where is this guy?" followed by a "Look over there, I'll check this area." It was official. I was being hunted. I don't know how long I stayed up that tree. It can't have been more than 10 minutes, and more likely it was quite a bit less than that, but it felt like forever. At some point, I decided to risk another flight, though I can't remember what triggered it. Car doors, the car driving away, I just can't remember. I do remember jumping from the tree and landing with a hard thud and bolting back the way I had come as fast as I could, terrified that whatever sound made me feel like it was safe to come out of hiding had been a ploy to draw me out. At the intersection where they had made the U-turn was a 24-hour gas station, of course across both roads. All I could think was that if I could make it inside, I would be safe and I could call the police. That run is a total blur, but I remember going through the door. I remember the look on the clerk's face as she saw my panicked expression. I called the police and explained what happened, and I waited inside for them to arrive. When they got there, I went out front to meet them and explained everything to the only officer who actually spoke to me. He was not sympathetic. I had described the car in detail, as well as all the events, and he said that they probably thought I was a male prostitute and were trying to pick me up. I thought to ask him if prostitutes get a lot of business by fleeing from prospective Johns and hiding in trees, but I was distracted by the sight of the red hatchback slowly cruising by, watching me talk to the police. I pointed to the car and exclaimed that that was the car. The police seemed entirely uninterested. He glanced at the car for half a second and looked back at me and said, "What do you want me to do about it?" "I don't want to walk anymore," I exclaimed. I'm sure there were better ways I could have articulated that there were people attempting to capture me for unknown nefarious purposes, and that I was in fear of my life should they encounter me on the street again, but "I don't want to walk anymore" was all I was capable of in that moment. The cop pointed to the side of the police car and said, "You see what it says there? It says police, not taxi." His condescending attitude was doing a great job to replace my fear with some of the brash attitude that had gotten me into the situation in the first place. So I replied, "It also says to serve and protect, and I am asking you to protect me because I think I am in danger." He gave a sigh like a teenager asked to do the dishes and told me that he can't take me all the way because I lived in the next town and county over, but that he'd take me to the county line, which is another major intersection along that same main highway. That was still a good 5.5 miles from my house. Again, a number I just looked up for this telling, but got me off the road for almost 3 miles and made it less likely these people would find me again. The cops dropped me off in front of the museum, and I walked another 2 hours or so, looking over my shoulder constantly, ready to run down side streets or jump into bushes if need be. My girlfriend's house was slightly closer than my own, and with the sun now rising, I knew she'd be okay with me stopping in. In the end, I made it safely and never saw that red car again. Almost 30 years later, I still sometimes wonder what might have become of me if they had gotten their hands on me. The determination they showed in pursuing me leads me to believe that nothing I can imagine, no matter how bad, is outside the realm of possibility. So, hunting party in the red hatchback, let's not meet. I, a 33-year-old father, live in Texas with my daughter Alicia, who's 8 years old, and my son Jay, who is 4 months old. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years. Not dead, just divorced. I've managed pretty well as a single father. The three of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right night was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair. Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words and the fear in my daughter's voice really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. Did you open them? Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise. What did you hear? Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment, and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part though was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up, then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally, wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, come here motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning before work and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop screwing with us and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the chuk-chuk sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of cutting. When he saw me and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. face. His cartoonish grin faded and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features: rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation and that particular window is very tall, so even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my chest, but I knew I had to stay calm, even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kids' tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow, he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that, from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then, something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assumed was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The two looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? A few summers ago, my friend Lexi, not her real name, and I went on a road trip down from Virginia, where we both live, to Florida. We had such a great time that we went again next year, but this time we went to New York. It was so much fun just hanging out with her on the road for days at a time that it was a no-brainer to head off once again this summer, and this time we planned to road trip to Dallas and then Phoenix. It was the week after finals week and we were all packed and ready to go. Lexi had just gotten her full license over winter break, so she was super excited to do some of the driving, which she did before anyway, but she was always so afraid of getting caught that it wasn't ever for very long. I drove over to her house and helped her throw all her bags into the trunk and back seat of my dad's old green and gray Subaru. Some of the bags were too big to fit in the trunk, so we threw them in the back seat, a couple duffels covering the footwells behind our seats, which wouldn't have been in the way of us reclining our seats to sleep on the nights we didn't have a motel booked. We had the whole trip planned out, everywhere we'd stop to eat, sleep, refill gas. By this point we were practically pros at road tripping. With everything prepared and settled, we set off around noon. The route we had first went south, then cut through the middle of Alabama towards Dallas. We stopped for dinner in Birmingham, Alabama about 8 hours into the trip. After that we were going to drive the last 3 hours to a city just across the border in Mississippi, but we completely lost track of time, staying at the diner in Birmingham for like 2.5 hours. When we got back on the road, the plan was still to try to make it to the city in Mississippi, but after only an hour, I was afraid to squint too much at the other car's headlights and risk accidentally falling asleep. Lexi was also way too exhausted to drive, and neither of us really loved the idea of stopping in some random town in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, but we also didn't love the idea of getting to Mississippi just a few hours before the sun rose and having to keep driving on less than 5 hours of sleep. So Lexi took out her phone and I parked in the breakdown lane while she looked for nearby motels for us to stay at. There weren't many cars on the road so late at night. It was taking forever for the web pages to load on her phone, so I turned the car off and we sat in the silence of us both being just desperate to find somewhere to sleep. After a while and a few grunts of frustration from Lexi, I was about to suggest we just find somewhere to park and sleep in the car when a pair of headlights pulled into the rearview mirror. An old red truck, one with only the front seats, turned its hazards on and parked right behind us, and I turned to Lexi, expressing the same anxiety I was feeling. My hands were shaking a little when I went to put the keys in the ignition, and we drove away before whoever pulled in behind us could talk to us. I pulled off the interstate at the next exit sign. We don't even remember seeing a sign for the town's name anywhere on the off-ramp, just a pitch black night besides our high beams, and the trees and speed limit signs caught in front of them. The first road off the highway was empty and full of potholes that were felt but unseen. Lexi pointed on the map on her phone to a public park where we could park and sleep for the night. After maybe 20 minutes of trying to navigate the roads of this town without GPS, passing horribly decrepit homes and commercial buildings with faded signs, we finally found the park and parked sideways in the lot. In the headlights, we could make out a terribly run-down swing set, a slide, and a seesaw, all made of old, rotting wood. We made sure the doors were locked and spent the night in the car. Lexi and I both woke up the next morning at about the same time, 7:15. Sitting up, we both got a better look at the town we'd parked in. Across the street from the park, there was an abandoned house. Its windows and doors boarded up, and its front lawn was overgrown, up as high as the porch. Just next to it was a house with trash bags filling the front lawn all the way to the weed-infested sidewalk. Surrounding everything was a sparse, hazy forest, and the rest of town was some ways behind us. I turned the car on and tried to blast cold air, but all that came through was swelteringly hot. Desperate to get out of the heat and both starving, we fought the urge to leave that town as soon as possible and instead headed towards the center in hopes of finding somewhere to eat breakfast before we continued our trip. Traveling deeper into the town didn't show us anything better than what we'd seen before. Flat, barren, and almost entirely deserted, this weird town only got weirder when we found an old diner. The sign in the window said it was open, so we gave it a shot. Pulling into the parking lot, there were only 2 other vehicles parked, and one of them looked exactly like the red truck from the night before. Lexi pointed it out and suggested it might even be the same one, and that was weird, but we definitely didn't feel it was weird enough to raise any red flags in our minds. Stepping inside, we were met with a room only marginally colder than outside and a blast of air from a standing fan right beside the door. The diner was more like a bar with a few wooden tables pushed up against the walls. A jukebox was up against the wall playing some some 80s rock, but it was hardly loud enough to contend with the 6 box fans they had affixed to every window. Sat in the corner of the diner, there was a man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, staring down at a cup. His hair was almost unignorably greasy, glistening in the sunlight poking through the shredded blinds of the window beside him. The whole diner reeked of cat piss, and I felt myself almost turning to leave when we were greeted by a woman on the other side of the bar. She asked what we wanted to drink, and I turned to Lexi, kind of hoping she'd be the one brave enough to walk away. Instead, she shrugged and joined the woman at the bar, sitting up on one of the stools. There were only 2 things listed on the menu for breakfast, and I hardly remember anything about what we ordered except that we both ate it very quickly and it all tasted stale. The man from before wasn't sitting at the table anymore when we left the diner, and I remember noticing that the red truck wasn't there anymore either. We hit the road and made it to Dallas a whole hour earlier than the route predicted and got a chance to do most of the things on our list. An uneasy feeling persisted in my stomach throughout the day, which kinda ruined most of our destinations, but I tried my best not to drag Lexi down with me. I had no idea what was going on, there was just a horrible feeling that I was always being watched, but every time I looked around I either saw nobody or there were so many people that I couldn't find whoever was watching me even if they existed. Then I finally saw him. We had just arrived at Reunion Tower in the afternoon. It was when we stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed I saw him, the man from the diner, his eyes staring right back at me through his long black hair. My heart dropped and I felt sick, almost collapsing into Lexi. The weight of the paranoia I'd been feeling all day came crashing down at once, and I could barely breathe enough to explain to her what I just saw. The idea that this guy must have been following us all the way from Alabama seemed to click in both our heads at the same time. The other people in the elevator looked disgusted overhearing our conversation, all about as disturbed about the idea as Lexi and I were. A woman and her husband offered to walk with us back to our car, and Lexi and I tried to decline, but they had already made up their minds about us, so they went with us anyway. I'll admit it, I felt a lot better in their company, especially since none of us saw the man again on our way back to the car. We thanked the couple and left as fast as we could out of Dallas, headed west towards Phoenix. This second night we planned would take us out into the desert of New Mexico, where we'd get a chance to see the Milky Way galaxy and stargaze. It was around midnight that we reached the road we scouted on Google Maps. Lexi parked the car on a stretch of empty road and we stepped out into the quiet night, and the sky was beautifully clear. We soaked in the night sky for as long as we could before sleep started to overcome us and we got back in our car. An hour passed and Lexi was fast asleep, but I just couldn't sit still. I was tossing and turning and my heart was pounding with paranoia, and a bad smell kept wafting past my nose, and I really couldn't manage to get any shut-eye. Eventually, exhausted, I sat up in my seat, lifting the back and staring out at the road. My eyes darted all around the dark night horizon, looking for something to explain this feeling that has now followed me from Dallas. Like someone is still watching me, like I'm not safe. My palms are getting clammy and I bite my lip, my gaze flickering up at the rearview mirror where a set of headlights have appeared over the horizon. With my heart lurching in my stomach, I quickly stuck the keys in the ignition and hit the gas, desperate to escape this feeling and whoever's following us. Was that car following us? I didn't know, I didn't care. I had this awful feeling in my gut, and I wasn't going to just lie around and wait to find out why I was feeling it. Lexi jerked awake as I hit the gas, but didn't have many questions when she saw the headlights behind us. When the maps finally loaded, I found the nearest motel, which was about a half hour away, but I wouldn't have cared if it was 4 hours away. I didn't feel safe sleeping in the car at all, and with that car already long gone behind us before I even reached the highway, I suppose I was just waiting for any excuse to get up and out of there. I triple checked that the door to our motel room was locked before collapsing onto the bed and passing out as soon as the adrenaline wore off. Lexi woke me up the following morning all distressed, pulling me out of bed and up to the window. Can you guess what was parked a few spaces away from our car? That exact same red truck from the interstate and the diner. I already started to feel a little less crazy for not taking any chances with those headlights the night before. Desperate for answers, we left our motel room to scope the red truck out. It took every ounce of courage that we had to just approach the truck. We nervously peered inside. It was messy, full of fast food wrappers and soda cans and napkins, and a pale grime was forming on the edges of the windows, probably from smoking. Importantly, however, the man from the diner wasn't inside. Shaking, we checked out of the motel and hit the road, hoping that he might still be asleep in his room and won't know where we're going. I'm starting to get really paranoid now, and Lexi is trying to calm me down and drive at the same time. I tell her we shouldn't go to Phoenix anymore, thinking maybe this guy knows our plans, but she tells me that's ridiculous. I remind her that he's already followed us all the way from Alabama, but I can tell she's starting to get really irritated. She doesn't want to hear me suggest we turn back, and I could hardly blame her. I was also pretty angry at the idea that this trip would be ruined, because some creep decided to ruin it, but I also didn't want to end up in the newspaper. Regardless, she managed to soothe me enough to be on board with the idea of staying on track and finishing our road trip. We crossed the state of New Mexico and ended in Phoenix, Arizona at around sunset. Even despite the tensions and stresses we both shared, I think that it would have been impossible for us to both sit in still silence for 10 whole hours. Eventually we started talking again and getting back into the good vibe that we were seeking in this road trip in the first place. We started to joke about the creepy guy following us, saying we must be drop dead gorgeous for someone to chase us across 5 states. Although each quip had an undertone of discomfort, we were trying really hard to move on and have a good time despite it all. In all the long stretches of empty desert freeway, we didn't see that truck once, and in the way the panic died down as the day went on, we really were starting to enjoy ourselves once more. At one point on the road we were starving, hoping still to make it to Phoenix before the sunset, and also perhaps a bit afraid to stop driving in case that red truck catches back up with us. Lexi told me she had a box of granola bars in her bag in the back seat. I reached back and unzipped it, taking the open box out and bringing it into the front seat. Lexi paused with a weird look on her face and asked if I had opened the box, to which I said I hadn't, and to which she said she must have opened it and forgotten. But with the look on her face, it was clear that she didn't really fully believe herself. Those kept us going until Phoenix, where we stopped at a McDonald's and headed inside for a chance to stretch our legs. We ate fast and left to head to the motel and check in, but when we did, we were told they were completely full. Lexi was starting to lose her mind as we drove around the city trying to find another motel within our price range that wasn't completely occupied. When we eventually found one, we went inside to find one of the beds soaking wet for literally no reason. Full of exhausted anger, she stormed down to the clerk and practically screamed at him. He offered her a new room at no cost, but she just stormed out and back to the car, so I followed her. We got into the hot car and she had a breakdown, sobbing into the steering wheel. I tried to console her, but the truth was I was almost surprised I wasn't crying right there with her. I was able to keep my composure and we switched seats, and I drove us out to find somewhere to sleep in the car for the night. We lied there in the car, the engine half on and AC blasting freezing air to keep the interior habitable, and just grieved our ruined road trip. Tried to make the plans up to think of another time this summer we might get a chance to give it another go. Eventually she fell asleep basically mid-sentence and I tried to follow suit. The street lamp a few yards behind the car dimly illuminated the roof of the car as I stared up at it. That terrible smell crept back into my nose, but it lingered instead of wafting past. It was like a mix of vinegar and sewage, and I almost gagged, covering my nose and mouth with the shirt I'd taken off. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and that feeling came back, here, a state and a half away from where we last saw that truck. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't rest my mind once again. I groaned and rubbed my eyes vigorously, pulling the seat back upright. It hissed like a gasp as it pulled up and I paused, quietly turning towards the back seat. Lexi's seat was reclined back over her bags that covered the footwell completely, obscured it absolutely. Trembling, I shook Lexi awake. She opened her eyes and I silently hushed her. She sat up and I pointed at the bag just behind my seat. I turned the AC off and we both stared. The bag rose and fell with a hushed breath that wasn't either of ours. Horror pulled at her eyelids. A scream climbed her throat, but she bit her lip as her eyes started to water. Her nails clattered against the door handle as she panikedly threw the door open and leapt out of the car. I rushed out right after her, but before I closed the door, I pushed my seat back down and nearly tripped into the road as I stumbled out. Lexi was already pacing up towards the lamp and I threw my shirt back on as I rushed to the sidewalk at her side. She was hyperventilating and cursing, and I took my phone out, barely able to dial for 911. It was just then that I started crying, trying to explain what we both just thought we saw. A man was hiding in the back seat of our car. I threw up in my mouth and sat down to catch my breath. Lexi couldn't stand still and couldn't muster a single coherent sentence, just pacing and staring back at the the car, waiting for the police to show up. A few cruisers showed up and the police called for the man in the back of our car to step out. When nothing happened, they opened the doors and paused, pulling him out onto the street to administer CPR. The man had long, greasy black hair and laid strewn out lifelessly on the asphalt. They pronounced him dead at the scene, having suffocated under my reclined seat. Tucked away under our seats, they found a small knife and some zip ties, and the thought of what he might have done had I allowed myself to fall asleep brought me to my knees, relieving sick on the sidewalk while Lexi tried to comfort me with her trembling hands. We stayed in a hotel for a couple days while my dad drove over to pick us up. He had the Subaru towed back and Lexi and I both just went home. I don't even know what to do with myself at this point, honestly. I know it isn't my fault, but I can't help but feel horrible for not catching on sooner. I feel really stupid, I don't know. I've been free for exactly 2 days, 12 hours, and 17 minutes. Not that I'm counting, actually that's a lie, I am counting. Every second feels like a miracle and a nightmare simultaneously. Every tick of freedom is weighed down by what I know and what I can't bring myself to tell anyone. 3 years. That's how long I was held in that basement. At least that's what they are estimating at the hospital due to my blood work. Time blurred together in that windowless room, marked only by the steady drip of a leaking pipe and his footsteps on the stairs. That drip, that goddamn drip. Sometimes I would lie awake counting them until I reached thousands, feeling my sanity slip away with each watery pulse. I don't remember who I was before, not anymore. The worst part is knowing that I used to remember. For the first few months of captivity, I clung to my identity like a lifeline. I had a name, I had a home, I had people who loved me, I had a life, but he couldn't stand it when I'd recite these facts to myself in the dark. He'd fly into rages when I'd whisper my real name over and over like a prayer. "You're no one," he'd scream, bringing his fists down on my head, my face, my temples. "You're mine now, nothing else." The doctors at the hospital believe I have severe brain damage from repeated trauma. Scans show old fractures in my skull that healed without medical attention. Dark patches on my brain where blood pooled and scarred. Memory centers damaged beyond repair. Now the police ask questions I can't answer. Did I have family, friends, a job, a home? The only clear memory I have from before is standing outside a Trader Joe's, nearly dropping a paper bag of groceries as one of the handles ripped. It was raining lightly. I remember thinking I should have brought an umbrella. Then a hand clamped over my mouth, a bag over my head, the smell of chemicals, darkness. When I woke up, I was in that room. Concrete walls stained with substances I tried not to identify. A thin mattress on the floor that reeked of mold and worse things. A bucket in the corner that he'd empty only when the stench became unbearable even to him. A single light bulb hanging from the ceiling that he would turn on and off at random intervals, destroying any sense of day or night I might have clung to. The first month I screamed until my vocal cords shredded. I clawed at the door until my fingernails tore off, leaving bloody streaks on the wood. I begged whatever God might be listening to either save me or kill me. Neither happened. He never told me his name. I never saw his face clearly. At least, for the longest time I didn't see his face. Not that finally seeing it helped. I'll explain soon. He always wore a mask when he came down, a plain white medical mask at first, then more elaborate ones as time went on. Sometimes animals, sometimes cartoon characters. The Mickey Mouse one was the worst. He'd wear it on days he decided I needed to be disciplined. I won't describe what that entailed, I can't, not yet, maybe not ever. It was painful, horrific. That cheerful mouse face watching as he told me I was his masterpiece, a true blank canvas, that humans should be grateful for lives that are full of endless opportunities. Once he didn't feed me for 2 weeks, just water. By the end I was hallucinating, seeing shadows dance on the walls. When he finally came down with a plate of cold spaghetti, I wept with gratitude. I kissed his feet. I would have done anything. I did do anything. The strangest part was how routine it all became. The terror never fully subsided, but it evolved into something duller, more manageable. Sometimes he'd bring me books, dog-eared paperbacks with coffee stains and torn covers. Sometimes he'd sit in a folding chair and make me read to him, correcting my pronunciation instantly when I stumbled over words. Sometimes he'd leave a small radio that only picked up static and religious broadcasts. The preacher's voices became as familiar familiar as my own thoughts. When winter came, I could tell from the bone-deep chill that seeped through the concrete. He'd bring down a space heater sometimes, but only if I'd been good. I learned to stop shivering in his presence because it annoyed him. I learned to regulate my body temperature through sheer will. I learned things about survival that no human should know. I stopped asking why. I stopped begging to be released. I stopped speaking altogether around the 2-year mark. What was the point? The silence became my armor. He hated it. He'd scream at me, shake me, try anything to make me talk. But I'd retreated so far inside myself by then that my body was just an empty shell. Sometimes I would watch him from somewhere above, like I was floating near the ceiling, observing this broken girl with matted hair and skin stretched tight over protruding bones. The worst times were when he was kind, when he'd bring me a warm blanket, when he'd clean the infected cuts on my legs with surprising gentleness, when he'd read to me as I drifted off to sleep. Those moments confused me, made me question everything. Stockholm Syndrome, the hospital psychologist called it later. I call it hell. Then, 2 days ago, he came down the stairs without his usual measured steps. He was rushing, frantic, no mask this time, and his face, I know he wasn't wearing a mask and it was human skin, but no eyes, no mouth or hair, no ears or nose, no features at all, just a blank canvas. That's all I remember about his face. Time to go, he said, injecting something into my arm before I could react. As consciousness slipped away, I heard the basement door open again, shuffling, a muffled cry, another person. Your replacement has arrived, he whispered in my ear. I woke up on a park bench 20 miles from the house where I'd been held. My hospital bracelet says Jane Doe. The police have been kind but frustrated by my inability to provide details. I can't describe his face even though I finally saw it, but I remember his voice, the way it would soften when he was about to hurt me, the slight lisp on certain words, the wet sound of his mouth when he leaned close to whisper things he planned to do to me. It's strange how my brain protected some memories while obliterating others. The neurologist explained that severe, repeated head trauma can create a patchwork of memory loss. Your brain sacrificed your identity to preserve your survival instincts, she told me. Sometimes I still feel the phantom pain of those blows, the ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop for days, the world tilting as I tried to hold on to who I was before everything went dark. And last night, as a nurse was checking my vitals, I heard a news report on the small television in my hospital room. A 19-year-old girl had gone missing outside a Trader Joe's, one town over from where we are now. I should tell the police everything I know. I should help them find her. I should be doing something, anything. But I can't. I physically can't, because as he was preparing to release me after I'd heard those muffled cries from upstairs, unmistakably female, young, terrified, he grabbed my face with one gloved hand, squeezing until I thought my jaw would break. Listen carefully, he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. You're going to leave here, you're going to stay quiet. If I see one police sketch, if I hear one whisper that you're helping them find me, I will cut her throat while playing a recording of your voice. She'll die believing you killed her. He showed me a phone then, replaying snippets of my voice he'd recorded over the years. My pleas, my screams, even my reading voice from those bizarre sessions where he'd make me read aloud from classic novels for hours until my throat was raw. I've already told her all about you, he continued, how you helped pick her, how you're my partner. She thinks you've just gone out for supplies. His tone was nothing less than excited. She's waiting for you to come back, for 3 years just like you waited. But here's the thing that keeps me frozen, the thing I haven't told anyone until now. When he released me, he whispered something else. You did so well, I'll be coming back for you. This is just intermission. And remember, her blood will be on your hands if you talk. And on my discharge papers from the hospital, tucked into the folder the nurse gave me this morning, I found a small note on Mickey Mouse stationery. Miss you already. The new girl isn't nearly as much fun. She keeps asking when you're coming back. I told her you'd return soon to help me with her. TikTok. Along with the note was a small USB drive. When I plugged it in at a library far from the hospital, it contained only a single video file. 10 seconds of footage showing a young woman, blindfolded and gagged, huddled in the same corner of the same basement where I spent 3 years. A timestamp on the video showed it was recorded just 4 hours ago. In the background, my voice, pieces of recording stitched together saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back soon. We're going to have so much fun together." I've been free for exactly 2 days, 12 hours and 23 minutes, but I know I'm still not free at all, and neither is she. Just some background on this story. I, a 24-year-old female, was about 21 at the time, and commuting a decent distance to school from my parents' house. My parents live in a small town, and based on what I observed in high school, the dating pool there is slim. A couple years ago, I was still adjusting to the adult dating scene. I was using Tinder, and though I had been on a few dates and had a few hookups, it was mostly just situations where I either wasn't that interested in the guys, or it was strictly a one-night stand. There's a college town, not where I went to school, about 45 minutes from my parents' house, and I went on a few dates there. It's a cool city to hang out in, so it was always worth the journey even if a date didn't work out. The worst Tinder date I'd had at this point was one guy that went in for the kiss when I clearly wasn't feeling it. Like, I cringed away as he went to kiss me, so his mouth caught the edge of my mouth as I turned away, while trying and failing to not make a face. Very awkward, but by no means something where I felt my life was in danger. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. However, this story's different. We chatted through text after matching on Tinder, and though he wasn't exactly my usual type, he was charming enough. He was a little bit of the stoner type, and as a teenager I'd gone through my own emo phase. He was funny and confident over the phone as well. I usually made it a rule for myself to chat on the phone at least once or twice before meeting up with guys, even just to gauge if we would be able to carry a conversation. It's not the same when you're only texting. However, this was also to make sure the pictures and the voice matched up with the person I was meeting. We hit it off over the phone well enough to the point where I felt we should give hanging out a shot. We talked about how I went to karaoke night often at a local bar close to where I attended school. He said he and his friends liked going to karaoke too. Great. He lived in the previously mentioned college town, and I agreed to attending karaoke night with him and his friends. He said they were hanging out at a local coffee shop near where he and his roommate lived, and I could meet them there. A girl he knew worked there as well, and he said she'd give me a coffee on the house. Before leaving, I texted one of my friends where I was going just to be safe. When I arrived, I could clearly see into the coffee shop. I could see a group of 4 scraggly looking dudes and one girl behind the counter. As soon as I pulled up, I got a nagging bad feeling in my stomach. As soon as I got out of my car, the guy I had been chatting with left his group and came out. He said they were leaving right now, so we should just go. Not that I really cared about the coffee, but what happened to the coffee I was promised? I asked what exactly the plan was, and he said they were going to head back to his place before heading to karaoke. He didn't ask if I wanted anything from the shop, and didn't even ask if I wanted to come in. By this point, his friends came out and they all got close to my car. I was getting pretty bad vibes at this point. He isn't acting charming or funny like before on the phone. Everything felt forced. There was an air from the group that they were only pretending to be friendly. Nobody introduced themselves, but they just kept saying how awesome karaoke at the bar was. The girl inside at the counter had gone in the back of the shop, and because she was friends with them, I didn't know if I could trust her. Thinking quickly, I said the plan sounded great and I could drive and meet them there, that I didn't want to leave my car there. This apparently was a problem. The one car in the parking lot, which I had assumed was one of theirs, was the girls. They said they walked there, but it would be a lot better and faster if I just drove them back to the house. At this point, I'm panicking. Everyone's close to my car and me. I tell them a stupid lie and say that I have a bunch of stuff from school in my car, and it's pretty messy on top of that, so not everyone will be able to fit. Mind you, they are right by my car, standing in front of it. They can see through my windshield into it. It's got like a backpack in it, and that's it. I just lie and say I'm kind of embarrassed because the floor is messy. I'm saying anything I can to get out of this. I tell them I'm really sorry, but if they order an Uber, I can just meet them at their place. I'm not budging on not letting them get in my car. The guy I'm supposed to be on a date with tells the other guys to head back inside the coffee shop, and now I'm alone with him. He asks why I can't just drive everyone. He tells me it's not a big deal and that it's just easier if I drive everyone there. I stand firm that there's not room and my car's messy. I tell him I promise to meet him at his place if they order an Uber or walk. Just text me his address. He says that it'll take too long to get back to his place, so I should just meet them at the bar instead. He won't give me his address. He texts me the address to the bar, and I apologize about the car thing. I tell him I'm so excited for karaoke and I'll meet him there. I smile and act as naturally as possible, and then I get in my car and try to drive normally while in view. As soon as I'm out of sight, I take off and just drive in different directions haphazardly before heading back home. home. I was constantly watching in my mirrors to see if anyone followed me, and thankfully nobody did. Not long after arriving home, I got multiple texts from him. He told me I was just another girl pretending to be a nice girl. He told me I deserved to have my intestines ripped out and that I should be hung from the rafters by them. He told me when I was going to burn in hell and my sins against mankind would come back to haunt me. Clearly, I made the right call. People, always trust your gut. If you get a bad feeling, listen to it. You don't have to be nice. Do what you can to take yourself out of the situation and let your friends know where you're going ahead of time. Who knows, maybe the guy was ultimately harmless, but that's a risk I was not willing to take. I blocked his number and blocked him on Tinder. Never heard from him again, though I doubt I'll ever encounter him again. Creepy Tinder guy, let's not meet. I grew up in the exurbs of western Louisiana. Our small town was deeply religious, and this coupled with the crime wave of the 1980s meant that my childhood was spent largely cooped up inside. The first lick at freedom I got was Halloween night 1987. I was 13 and was allowed out until midnight with a group of my closest friends. What really sold my mother on the idea was Patrick. Patrick was the 17-year-old brother of my best friend Marv. Despite being feared by anyone younger than him, he was a good student and a good Christian, and all the adults he knew would fawn over him. Against his own will, he'd be accompanying our little group for the night. It was in Marv's family's basement that we watched the first half of Friday the 13th. Looking back, I'm sure I thought in the moment that that movie would be the most traumatizing thing I'd see all night. When Patrick entered the room, our laughter died mid-sentence. He wasn't tall, but carried himself like he was. I never liked him, but knew that not even his presence could bring down my mood tonight. After Marv's parents forced us out, we patrolled the neighborhood trick-or-treating. I think there were about 5 or 6 of us, not including Patrick. I knew all the other kids from either church or school, apart from Lenny, the kid brother of my friend Rob. I never knew, but I'm sure he was only around 7 or 8. I did remember that he was dressed in a clown costume. Apart from Lenny, the only other costumes I could remember were mine and Marv's. We both came dressed as Ghostbusters, and I'd brought an old black painted vacuum cleaner with me to really make it. It was after 10, after the trick-or-treating, that maybe 1 or 2 of us left the group to go back home. We all were giggling and messing around, high on sugar, not noticing that Patrick was leading us a little further away from the rows of white houses. The streetlights grew sparse, then vanished altogether. The laughter that had carried us through the night faltered, replaced by the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and the distant rhythmic croak of bullfrogs. The air thickened with the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. I remember Marv nudging me, his grin faltering for the first time that night. "Dude," he whispered, "where the hell is he taking us?" There was a small marshy clearing on the banks of the bayou. Large, thick roots served as makeshift benches which Patrick directed us onto. Confused, we sat in a crescent around him and watched in terror as he took a cigarette from his pocket, lit the end, and took a draw. He blew smoke into Marv's face and started to talk. He told us all that he had a story he wanted to share, a local legend that every kid in town should be aware of. We listened intently as he began telling us about Leatherskin. The story will always stick with me, and I will now try to repeat it as accurately as I can. I might miss out some of the details. It has been 38 years after all, but this will be the truest account of the original myth on the internet, as far as I know anyway. Leatherskin was born sometime in the late 40s or early 50s. Deformed, coarse brown calluses grew all over his body like spreading mycelium. His pus-colored eyes were nothing but tiny pinpricks, and the full set of teeth he was born with were too sharp to be breastfed. His father, the town's pastor, was terrified that his child was a satanic aberration, punishment for the sins of his youth. Despite his ailing wife's pleas, the pastor took his newborn to a murky corner of the swamp and left him in a patch of moss to die. By this point, Patrick had already piqued my interest. At 13, I'd already heard the name Leatherskin whispered before. I heard it from a kid in the playground when I was much younger, in the context that he was going to get me. It was a small part of local lore that I honestly knew nothing about. I didn't even know what Leatherskin was supposed to look like. On that Halloween night, I was ecstatic at the idea of finally getting to know. Unbeknownst to the pastor, he left his unwanted infant crying within earshot of a dilapidated shotgun house. The wooden shaking that was slowly sinking into the bayou was inhabited by an aged and dementia-ridden woman. She wandered from her home and followed the cries to that little patch of moss. When she found the baby, she took him in her arms and cradled him to silence. That night, she brought him back with her and raised him as her own. For years, she fed and clothed him, cared for and nurtured him, and did her best to keep him from harm's way. The senile old woman was barely able to speak herself, and, with no other human contact, Leatherskin grew up without a proficiency in any language. His diet consisted of raw seabird and other hapless swamp creatures until he reached puberty. By 13, Leatherskin was already almost 7 feet tall and had just begun to sneak out of his mother's home and into the small town on the other side of the overgrowth. He'd stalk through the backyards at night and kidnap family pets under the cover of darkness. This became his new routine, but as Leatherskin grew, so did his hunger. Sometime in the mid-1960s, a small girl wandered out into the swamp chasing a monarch butterfly. She was never seen again. From this point onwards, all sympathy had drained from Leatherskin's story. After his first feed on children's flesh, he could not go back. Kids began disappearing at a rate far higher than the national average. After the discovery of some semblance of human remains, the townsfolk would propound that these poor children were falling victim to alligator attacks. Hunts began soon after, and although many reptiles were killed, Leatherskin remained out of sight. The parents, however, stopped letting their children play outside, and especially not near the bayou. Leatherskin was forced to venture further into the small village and even broke into houses from time to time. It was after one of the Calloway twins disappeared from the edge of the schoolyard that people stopped saying gators and started to nail their windows shut instead. By this time, he had begun to spend much of his time in the water, clambering from root to root in the murky shallows. Anyone who did encounter him might have mistaken Leatherskin for a floating log or even a crocodilian. Few would have realized how close to death they'd come. Some hunters might have even seen the rundown cabin Leatherskin called home. It rested half sunken where the marshland met the slow running waters of the bayou. It was built by the father of Leatherskin's elderly adoptive mother, sometime in the 1870s or 80s I'd reckon. Back then, where it stood was dry land perched on a small riverbank. With more attraction, it could have developed into a township, taking the place of the one I called home a mile northwards. Shortly after the end of segregation, and immediately after Governor Wallace's loss in the 1968 presidential election, racial tensions in the state of Louisiana were at a fever pitch. Following more sightings and even a blurry photograph of Leatherskin, the highly fantasized story the local newspapers ran with were of a Creole cannibal living deep within the swamp. A racist mob was whipped up, and in one warm July night they descended into the quagmire, accompanied by the sheriff's men. By foot and by boat, the crowd came across Leatherskin's decaying house. Raiding it, they found only the senile octogenarian who'd raised the young demon. She was alive but unresponsive, as she had been for the past 2 years. In that time, she'd been kept alive, fed, and bathed by her de jure offspring. The gang of men soon realized she wasn't the sole occupant of the house, however, as the wooden frames weren't the only things rotting away. Led into the cramped upstairs by stench alone, they found piles of small bodies, most picked down to the bone. In the ensuing interrogation, the old woman sadly died. This was the beginning of the account from the sole survivor of that night's events. Once he regained speech a few days after, he told the reporters encamped around his hospital bed that shortly after, the door was ripped from its hinges. A blur entered the shack and tore the group of men apart, shrugging off gunfire like a metal drum as he did. The lone survivor, a teenage clerk from Rubio's Hardware, had only done so by leaping out of a brittle, mildew-frosted window. Leaving the screams behind him, he ran, coated in blood, through the maze of vines. In a panic, he twisted his ankle and crawled onto a mossy clearing lit by the moonlight. Eventually, he was found by one of the police boats used in the search, piloted by a bewildered deputy, and taken back into town. When a second search party came across the old cabin, they found what was left of the group of men. They were gored to pieces, strewn everywhere. The townsfolk burned the house, and as it went up in flames, its ancient foundations finally gave way and it slid into the murky water. No one knew what happened to Leatherskin, but to this day, our little town still has one of the highest disappearance rates in the contiguous United States. Some say Leatherskin is still alive and well, thriving in the swamp, still feeding on children. At least this was the story told to us by Patrick. Once Patrick finished his yarn, he looked around at the group of kids in front of him, gauging our belief or lack thereof. To my side, little Lenny was quivering in his clown costume, his eyes darting around the mangroves. I was conflicted on its validity, but I can remember that with the passion the story was told, I felt felt inclined to believe him. If I had fully believed him, I might have been less enthusiastic when Patrick quickly suggested that we should all go into the swamp and hunt for leatherskin ourselves. Since I watched Stand By Me, I yearned for the freedom I had seen in media. With an hour to midnight, I leapt from my seat on the root and fervently supported Patrick's plan. He threw his arm around my shoulder and spoke to the rest of the children, goading them to follow my example. I started to wish that I kept my mouth shut because 5 minutes later, our little posse was trudging through the swamp. One or two decided not to come with us, instead following the trail back the way we came and into town. A few of us had flashlights given to us by our overprotective parents that, combined with the brief cracks of moonlight gazing through the canopy, guided our path. We stuck to the elevated and dry sods of earth as best we could. Despite my attempts, I could feel the hanging ends of my pant leg dampen. Marv and I tried to hang back, and we talked and laughed like a pair of hyenas. The air was wet with sound, cicadas, toads, and the flow of the nearby bayou. Suddenly, Patrick put a commanding hand up and told us all to stop. We did, and looked around trying to find what sparked our sudden halt. Patrick turned to us with a sinister smile and said that he'd seen movement along the banks of the creek. "It's Leatherskin," I remember Patrick shouting at us. Lenny's breath hitched as his older brother pushed him forward. Patrick saw what the siblings were doing and decided to take it further. He said something along the lines of, "You're the youngest. Leatherskin will want you." With that, we all started chanting, pressuring the kid to take a few more steps towards the water's edge. Clearly terrified, but even more afraid of what a group of older boys could do to him, he did. In his little white clown suit with blue and red polka dots, he took a series of anxious steps forward as we roared around him. Joking, I shouted, "Oh my god, is that Leatherskin?" Lenny whirled around, almost losing his balance and falling backwards into the water. Tears were streaking down his white face paint now. "Stop it, guys, you're not funny," he screamed as we all bent double, laughing at him. Those words are etched into my mind because they were his last. A torrent of water swept onto the thin, stony bank as a great weight slammed into Lenny, having bitten onto his submerged ankles. He cried out in pain and shock and fell to hands and knees as he was dragged backwards. I was paralyzed with fear, as were Patrick and Marv, but Lenny's brother rushed forward to fight off the black shape. It wasn't until he splashed into the water that we snapped out of our trance of regret and ran to Rob's side. He grabbed him and stopped him from running fully into the bayou as Lenny was dragged underwater by what we came to realize was an alligator. We all stood soaking and staring at the carnage before us. The beast had begun to death roll, and Lenny's screams came in cycles, and he repeatedly breached and was then dragged under the water. Those same screams still rattle away in my nightmares whenever my mind dares to dream. His dying breath was carried as a bubble to the black water surface. Within a minute, maybe less, the white froth brought up by the thrashing had dissipated. Our collective gaze followed the disturbance in the water as it slowly moved away, off towards the tangle of mangroves. Rob fell to his knees by my side and sobbed gently into his hands. I heard Patrick gulp and turned to watch him wordlessly walk away from us, back in the direction of the trail. Marv and I helped Rob to his unsteady feet and followed Patrick. As soon as we caught up to him, he whipped around and furiously warned us not to tell a soul what had happened tonight. I was inclined to follow his advice, as was Marv, but we both knew Rob couldn't. Patrick sighed and took Rob by his forearm and led him away from us. I looked at Marv confused, but he just shrugged. A small while later, the two returned. Rob was crying with even more devastation now, and Patrick just sniffed indifferently. When I returned home that night, just 15 minutes past midnight, my mother immediately knew something was wrong. Despite her persistence, I explained to her that I was blackout tired, and as it was over 3 hours past my bedtime, she let me go to sleep as soon as I came through the door. I cried for most of the night and stayed awake long enough to hear sirens wailing from, I assumed, Rob's house. In the morning, my mother came into my room and quietly sat on my bed. She told me in a soft and distant voice that Lenny, the little brother of my friend Rob, had been reported missing. She then asked me if I knew anything about it. I told her in a shaky voice that I didn't, and my reply was followed by a few minutes of silence. My mother then leaned in and hugged me. I started to cry into her shoulder, and after some point she pulled away, gave me a shallow smile and left to my room. They never found Lenny, of course, nor did they find his remains. I didn't see Rob much after that night, but I often heard from my parents that Lenny's mother and father had shattered. I stayed friends with Marv until I moved to Baton Rouge at 19. I rarely visited my hometown, but recently, my mother passed away. I haven't spoken to her in years, let alone seen her in person. The funeral was organized by my sister, who now lived in the family home with her own family. I stayed with her for a week or two during the mourning learning period, and got to know my nieces and nephews properly for the first time. A few days ago, I was browsing around a local shop, one I worked at in the summer of 1990. It hadn't changed much, and I realized the new owner was an old school friend of mine. I was walking down aisle 3 when I bumped into him. I almost didn't recognize him at first, but he recognized me. It was Rob. Guilt still clung to him like kudzu. I could tell it in his gray eyes and broken smile. His hands trembled as he restocked a shelf of canned goods, his wedding ring loose on his thinning fingers. He somehow seemed smaller than he was when we were 13. We talked and vowed to talk more again one day, then said our goodbyes. I'm still not sure how much detail he told his parents of what happened that night, or if he's ever made peace with his own conscience. This post is my own admission. I'm not sure if the stories of Leatherskin are true. I did, however, tell them to my young nieces and nephews, in the hope they'll never venture near the swamp. Alligators infest these waters, and I'm certain it was one of those beasts that killed Lenny that night. I mean, what else could it be? I worked the night shift at a small local TV station in rural Montana. It's one of those jobs where you mostly just make sure nothing goes wrong with the automated broadcast system while everyone else is sleeping. 12 hours of mind-numbing boredom punctuated by occasional technical hiccups. At least that's what it was supposed to be. 3 weeks ago, I started noticing something strange happening during our 3 a.m. broadcast slot. We run old public domain movies during that time. Nobody's watching anyway, and it's cheap content to fill airtime. I was half asleep in the control room when I noticed something off about the black and white western playing on the monitor. There was a figure standing in the background of a scene where I could swear there hadn't been anyone before. It was just a silhouette, barely visible behind the main actors. I rewound the digital file, thinking maybe I just hadn't noticed it the first time through, but when I played it again, the figure was gone. I chalked it up to fatigue and too much coffee. Night shifts mess with your head, and I've seen weirder things while sleep deprived. But then it happened again the next night. This time it was during an old noir film. A woman was delivering a monologue in her apartment, and in the window behind her I saw a face peering in, just for a second before the camera angle changed. I jumped up and rewound the footage. Nothing there on the second viewing. I started recording our broadcast on my phone, thinking maybe there was some kind of transmission issue that was causing these glitches. The recording showed nothing unusual, but I kept seeing these anomalies on the live monitor. Fleeting shapes in the background, strange distortions in people's faces, background extras staring directly at the camera when they shouldn't be. Last week things escalated. The 3 a.m. slot was playing Night of the Living Dead, and halfway through, one of the zombie extras turned to face the camera and spoke. This wasn't part of the movie. I know because I've seen it dozens of times. The zombie's mouth moved, and though there was no audible sound, I could read the lips clearly. "We see you watching." I nearly fell out of my chair. I grabbed my phone and started recording, my hands shaking. When I played back the clip I'd recorded, the zombie was just shuffling around mindlessly like it was supposed to, but I know what I saw on the monitor. I tried telling my supervisor, but he just laughed it off. "Classic night shift paranoia," he said. "Take some vitamin D supplements. The lack of sunlight is getting to you." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just sleep deprived and imagining things. I considered requesting a schedule change, but the weird part is, I didn't want to. Something kept drawing me back to those late night broadcasts. I needed to know what was happening. 4 nights ago, I made a discovery. I noticed that these anomalies only appeared on broadcast signals, never on the digital files themselves. Something was intercepting or altering our broadcast between the station and the transmission. I set up a second monitor connected directly to our antenna feed to compare with our studio output. That night, the differences between the two feeds were undeniable. While the Maltese Falcon played normally on the studio monitor, the broadcast version showed subtle but unsettling differences. Background characters moved differently, scene transitions lingered a beat too long, and Humphrey Bogart's eyes, they were solid black like empty sockets. I started documenting everything, taking photos of both screens side by side. The photos showed the differences clear as day, so it wasn't just in my head. Something or someone was hijacking our broadcast signal. Last night I decided to stay after my shift ended at 6 a.m. to talk to the morning crew about what I'd found. That's when I made the most disturbing discovery yet. When the morning shift manager arrived, she looked at me strangely. "What are you doing here, Alex? You're not scheduled until tonight." I told her I had just finished my shift, but she shook her head and showed me the schedule on her tablet. According to the official record, I hadn't worked last night, or the night before, or any night in the past 2 weeks. but I had been here. I had the photos on my phone to prove it. Except when I checked my phone, the photos were gone, the recordings were gone, everything was gone. The only evidence I had was a single text message I had sent to myself at 3:17 a.m. last night that simply read, "It's replacing us one by one." I don't remember sending that message. I went home in a daze, convinced I was losing my mind. When I arrived at my apartment, my key didn't work. After several attempts, my neighbor came out and asked if I needed help. "Hey, are you looking for Alex?" she asked, not recognizing me. "He moved out about 2 weeks ago. Are you a friend of his?" I stood there unable to speak. How could she not recognize me? I've lived next door to her for 3 years. I managed to mumble something about having the wrong apartment and walked away. I'm writing this now from a motel room, using a laptop I bought today. I don't know who or what has taken over the broadcast, but I think it's spreading beyond the signal now. Tonight at 3 a.m., every TV in this town will be airing our public domain movie slot. I don't know how many people might be watching: insomniacs, night shift workers, people who fall asleep with their TVs on, but I know something will be watching back through those screens. I'm going back to the station tonight. I need to find a way to stop the broadcast. If you're reading this and you live in a small town with a local TV station, do me a favor. Don't watch anything that airs at 3 a.m. And if you see someone who looks exactly like you walking around, run. Every summer when I was a child, my family would visit our relatives in the northwest of Ireland, in a rural, low-populated region. Leaving our home in England, we would road trip through Scotland before taking a ferry across the Irish Sea, driving a further 3 hours through the last frontier of the United Kingdom. My 2 older brothers and I would know when we were close to our relative's farm, because the country roads would suddenly turn bumpy as hell. The northwest of Ireland is a breathtaking part of the country. Its Atlantic coastway is wild and rugged, with pastoral green hills and misty mountains. The villages are very traditional, surrounded by numerous farms, cow, and sheep fields. My family and I would always stay at my grandmother's farmhouse, which stands out a mile away due its bright red-painted coating. These relatives are from my mother's side, and although the northwest, and even the rest of Ireland for that matter, is very sparsely populated, my mother's family is extremely large. She has a dozen siblings, which was always mind-blowing to me, and what's more, I have so many cousins I've yet to meet them all. I always enjoyed these summer holidays on the farm, where I would spend every day playing around the grounds and feeding the different farm animals. Although I usually played with my 2 older brothers on the farm, by the time I was 12 they were too old to play with me and would rather go round to one of our cousins' houses nearby to either ride dirt bikes or play video games, so I was mostly stuck on the farm by myself. Luckily, I had one cousin, Grana, who lived close by and was around my age. Grana was a tomboy, and so we more or less liked the same activities. I absolutely loved it here, and so did my brothers and my dad. In fact, we loved the northwest of Ireland so much we even talked about moving here. But for some strange reason, although my mum was always missing her family, she was dead against any ideas of relocating. Whenever we asked her why, she would always have a different answer. There weren't enough jobs, it's too remote, and so on. But unfortunately for my mum, we always left the family decisions to a majority vote, and so if the 4 out of 5 of us wanted to relocate to the northwest of Ireland, we were going to. On one of these summer evenings on the farm, and having neither my brothers or Gran to play with, my uncle Dave, who ran the family farm, asks me if I'd like to come with him to see a baby calf being born on one of the nearby farms. Having never seen a newborn calf before, I enthusiastically agreed to tag along. Driving for 10 minutes down the bumpy country road, we pull outside the entrance of a rather large cow field, where, waiting for my uncle Dave, were 3 other farmers. Knowing how big my Irish family was, I assumed I was probably related to these men too. Getting out of the car, these 3 farmers stare instantly at me, appearing both shocked and angry. Striding up to my uncle Dave, one of the farmers yells at him, "What the hell's this Wayne doing here?" Taken back a little by the hostility, I then hear my uncle Dave reply, "He needs to know. You know as well as I do they can't move here." Feeling rather uncomfortable by this confrontation, I was now somewhat confused. What do I need to know? And more importantly, why can't we move here? Before I can turn to Uncle Dave to ask him, the 4 men quickly halt their bickering and enter through the field gate entrance. Following the men into the cow field, the late evening had turned dark by now, and not wanting to ruin my good trainers by stepping in any cow pats, I walked very cautiously and slowly. So slow, in fact, I'd gotten separated from my uncle's group. Trying to follow the voices through the darkness and thick grass, I suddenly stop stop in my tracks, because in front of me, staring back with unblinking eyes, was a very large cow, so large I at first mistook it for a bull. In the past, my Uncle Dave had warned me not to play in the cow fields because if cows are with their calves, they may charge at you. Seeing this huge cow staring stonewall at me, I really was quite terrified, because already knowing how freakishly fast cows can be, I knew if it charged at me, there was little chance I would outrun it. Thankfully, the cow stayed exactly where it was, before losing interest in me and moving on. I know it sounds ridiculous talking about my terrifying encounter with a cow, but I was a city boy after all. Although I regularly fed the cows on the family farm, these animals still felt somewhat alien to me, even after all these years. Brushing off my close encounter, I continued to try and find my Uncle Dave. I eventually found them on the far side of the field's corner. Approaching my uncle's group, I then see they're not alone. Standing by them were 3 more men and a woman, all dressed in farmer's clothing. But surprisingly, my cousin Granna was also with them. I go over to Gran to say hello, but she didn't even seem to realize I was there. She was too busy staring over at something behind the group of farmers. Curious as to what Granna was looking at, I move around to get a better look, and what I see is another cow, just a regular red cow, laying down on the grass. Getting out my phone to turn on the flashlight, I quickly realized this must be the cow that was giving birth. Its stomach was swollen, and there were patches of blood stained on the grass around it. But then I saw something else. On the other side of this red cow, nestled in the grass beneath the bushes, was the calf, and rather sadly it was stillborn. But what greatly concerned me wasn't that this calf was dead. What concerned me was its appearance. Although the calf's head was covered in red slimy fur, the rest of it wasn't. The rest of it didn't have any fur at all, just skin. And what made every single fiber of my body crawl was that this calf's body, its brittle infant body, it belonged to a human. Curled up into a fetal position, its head was indeed that of a calf. But what I should have been seeing as 2 front and hind legs were instead 2 human arms and legs, no longer or shorter than my own. Feeling terrified and at the same time in disbelief, I leave the calf, or whatever it was, to go back to Granna, all the while turning to shine my flashlight on the calf, as though to see if it still had the same appearance. Before I can make it back to the group of adults, Gran stops me. With a look of concern on her face, she stares silently back at me before she says, "You're not supposed to be here, it was supposed to be a secret." Telling her that Uncle Dave had brought me, I then ask what the hell that thing was. "I'm not allowed to tell you," she says. "This was supposed to be a secret." 20 or 30 so minutes later, we were all standing around as though waiting for something, before the lights of a vehicle pull into the field and a man gets out to come over to us. This man wasn't a farmer, he was some sort of veterinarian. Uncle Dave and the others bring him to tend to the calf's mother, and as he did, me and Gran were made to wait inside one of the men's tractors. We sat inside the tractor for what felt like hours. Even though it was summer, the night was very cold, and I was only wearing a soccer jersey and shorts. I tried prying Grande for more information as to what was going on, but she wouldn't talk about it, or at least wasn't allowed to talk about it. Luckily, my determination for answers got the better of her, because more than an hour later, with nothing but the cold night air and awkward silence to accompany us both, Gran finally gave in. This happens every couple of years to all the farms here, but we're not supposed to talk about it, it brings bad luck. I then remembered something. When my dad said he wanted us to move here, my mum was dead against it. If anything, she looked scared just considering it. Almost afraid to know the answer, I work up the courage to ask Granna, "Does my mum know about this?" Sat stiffly in the driver's seat, Granna cranes her neck round to me. Of course she knows, Granna reveals. Everyone here knows. It made sense now. No wonder my mum didn't want to move here. She never even seemed excited whenever we planned on visiting, which was strange to me because my mum clearly loved her family. I then remembered something else. A couple of years ago, I remember waking up in the middle of the night inside the farmhouse, and I could hear the cows on the farm screaming. The screaming was so bad I couldn't even get back to sleep that night. The next morning, rushing through my breakfast to go play on the farm, Uncle Dave firmly tells me and my brothers to stay away from the cowshed. He didn't even give an explanation. Later on that night, after what must have been a good 3 hours, my Uncle Dave and the others come over to the tractor. Shaking Uncle Dave's hand, the veterinarian then gets in his vehicle and leaves out the field. I then noticed 2 of the other farmers were carrying a black bag or something, each holding separate ends as they walked. I could see there was something heavy inside, and my first thought was they were carrying the dead calf, or whatever it was, away. Appearing as though everyone was leaving now, Uncle Dave comes over to the tractor to say say we're going back to the farmhouse, and that we would drop Grana home along the way. Having taken Gran home, we then make our way back along the country road, where both me and Uncle Dave sat in complete silence. Uncle Dave driving, just staring at the stretch of road in front of us, and me staring silently at him. By the time we get back to the farmhouse, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the farm was dead silent. Pulling up outside the farm, Uncle Dave switches off the car engine. Without saying a word, we both remain in silence. I felt too awkward to ask him what I had just seen, but I knew he was waiting for me to do so. Still not saying a word to one another, Uncle Dave turns from the driver's seat to me, and he tells me everything Gran wouldn't. "Don't you see now why you can't move here?" he says. "There's something wrong with this place, son. This place is cursed. Your mammy knows. She's known since she was a Wayne. That's why she doesn't want you living here." Yo, so why does this happen? I ask him. "This has been happening for generations, son. For hundreds of years, the animals in the county have been giving birth to these things." The way my Uncle Dave was explaining all this to me, it was almost like a confession. Like he'd wanted to tell the truth about what's been happening here all his life. It's not just the cows, it's the pigs, the sheep, the horses, and even the dogs. The dogs, it's always the same. They have the head as normal, but the body's always different. It was only now, after a long and terrifying night, that I suddenly started to become emotional. And I was completely exhausted. Realizing this was all too much for a young boy to handle, I think my Uncle Dave tried to put my mind at ease. "Don't you worry, son. They never live." Although I wanted all the answers, I now felt as though I knew far too much. But there was one more thing I still wanted to know. What do they do with the bodies? "Don't you worry about it, son. Just tell your mammy that you know. But don't go telling your brothers or your daddy now. She never wanted them knowing." By the next morning, and constantly rethinking everything that happened the previous night, I look around the farmhouse for my mom. Thankfully, she was alone in her bedroom folding clothes, and so I took the opportunity to talk to her in private. Entering her room, she asks me how it was seeing a calf being born for the first time. Staring back at her warm smile, my mouth opens to make words, but nothing comes out, and instantly, my mom knows what's happened. "I could kill your Uncle Dave," she says. "He said it was going to be a normal birth." Breaking down in tears right in front of her, my mom comes over to comfort me in her arms. "It's okay, chicken, there's no need to be afraid." After she tried explaining to me what Grana and Uncle Dave had already told me, her comforting demeanor suddenly turned serious. Clasping her hands upon each side of my arms, my mum crouches down, eyes level with me, and with the most serious look on her face I'd ever seen, she demands of me, "Listen, chicken, whatever you do, don't you dare go telling your brothers or your dad. They can never know. It's going to be our little secret, okay?" Still with tears in my eyes, I nod a silent yes to her. "Good man yourself," she says. We went back home to England a week later. I never told my brothers or my dad the truth of what I saw, of what really happens on those farms, and I refused to ever step foot inside the northwest of Ireland again.
If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Let me know your thoughts of these stories in the comments below. I frequently talk to my viewers there. But anyways, I hope you were creeped out.
Just kidding. Stay safe.